Section 3 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 2, Henry of Richmond, Bosworth Field, the Coronation, the Sweating Sickness, 1485-1486, Part 2. It was necessary at once to settle by what title Henry should claim the throne. The right of conquest was suggested, but at once put aside from an instinctive sense of the principle, explained by a great authority of our time in a celebrated judgment, that when a country is conquered, its inhabitants retain for the time their own laws, but are under the power of the sovereign to alter these laws in any way which to the sovereign in council may seem proper. Men were as clear on this point in 1485 as they were when the conquest theory was broached in 1693 in favour of King William III, and when it excited, as Lord Macaulay tells us, a complete tempest of indignation against its unlucky propounder. There was another resemblance between the two periods, namely, that Henry was as determined as William was in after days not to be a mere king consort. If he married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, he would not owe his title to her. Accordingly, on August 22nd, he assumed the crown in virtue of his Lancastrian descent, without making the least mention of Elizabeth. And in order to guard against Yorkist competition, he imprisoned in the Tower the Earl of Warwick, the son of the Duke of Clarence, whom Edward IV had murdered. This unhappy young man had for a time been treated by Richard III as his heir, but then put aside in favour of another nephew, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, the son of Richard's sister Elizabeth. The chief part of the Warwick property was dealt with in a manner characteristic of Henry. He ordered its restoration to Anne, Countess of Warwick, the widow of the Kingmaker, but forced this aged lady at once to execute a fiefment, granting to the king and his heirs all that had been her husband's and her own. This property included the islands of Guernsey, Jersey, and Sark, the city of Worcester, the town and castle of Warwick, and a vast number of manors and lordships in 19 counties of England. Only a moderate pension and one manor in Warwickshire was left to her, who, when young, had been the greatest lady in England. Nothing was reserved for her granddaughter Margaret, who afterwards married Sir Richard Pole, and is well known as the Countess of Salisbury, executed by Henry VIII in 1541. On September 28th, Henry made his entry into London in a close chariot, says Lord Bacon, in order to strike reverence into the people. A theory of Henry's motives, which has been curiously amplified by a German historian of England, who dilates on his strange conduct in thus withdrawing himself, popular and triumphant as he was, from the homage which awaited him in the streets, and yet resuming his military character in order to consecrate his standards in St. Paul's. The truth is, however, that Bernard André, the historian of Henry, really spoke of him as entering London laetanter, and that Lord Bacon's close chariot, as well as Pauly's longer paraphrase, is due to a misreading of this word as latenter. Henry immediately announced his intention of marrying Elizabeth. She was sent for from Sheriff's Hutton and placed under her mother's protection till the coronation was over and Henry's first Parliament had been held. He thus guarded with almost superfluous care against the chance of being thought to claim the crown through her. There was some fear that the prevalence in London of the sweating sickness might delay the inauguration, but as the force of the disease abated within 2 months, it was possible to perform it on October 31st following. The marriage did not take place till January 18th in the next year. Henry was sparing of new creations on his accession, but his stepfather, Lord Stanley, was made Earl of Derby, his uncle, Jasper Tudor, Duke of Bedford, and Sir Edward Courtenay, Earl of Devon. On the other hand, Pecuniary grants were abundant in the first months of the reign. As a matter of course, the chief sufferers in Henry's cause were reinstated in their property, often with large additions. Such were his mother, the Lady Margaret, now Countess of Derby; Sir Thomas Stafford, the son and heir of the late Duke of Buckingham; Catherine, Duchess of Bedford, the same Duke's widow; and Piers Courtenay, Bishop of Exeter, who, like his brother Sir Edward, had been with Henry in exile. To John, Earl of Oxford, whose father had lost his life in the Lancastrian struggle, and who had distinguished himself in 1473 by the seizure of St. Michael's Mount, was given the office of Admiral of England, Ireland, and Aquitaine. With this grant were joined many others, among which we should not have expected to find Lord Oxford's appointment as keeper of the lions, lionesses, and leopards in the Tower, with a shilling a day for himself and sixpence for the food of each animal. It may here be remarked once for all that in this reign money was about 12 times its present value. Another highly interesting restoration at this time was that of Henry Lord Clifford, the shepherd lord, whom Wordsworth has celebrated. His family had been attainted in 1461, and he himself concealed in a shepherd's hut to avoid the vengeance of the Yorkists for his father's murder of the child Earl of Rutland at the Battle of Wakefield. In this condition he passed 24 years, working at shepherd's tasks and learning to know the stars by watching them from the Cumberland fells. Some manuscripts still remain in the possession of the Clifford family, which prove his fondness for alchemy, a study which, though prohibited under pain of felony by a statute of Henry IV., had flourished in the very court of Henry VI., and was destined, as we shall see in a subsequent chapter, long to retain its hold on English belief. He was also given to astrology, which was then held to be the great practical use of star knowledge. Lord Clifford lived till the 10th year of Henry VIII., and in spite of the tranquil soul which the poet ascribes to him, distinguished himself highly at the Battle of Flodden. At the same time, an immense number of minor offices, such as the wardenships of royal parks and castles, were transferred from the supporters of Richard to those of Henry. Few comparatively were bestowed on Welshmen, though Sir Rhys ap Thomas, to whom Henry owed so much, was made Constable of Brecknock, Chamberlain of South Wales, and a Commissioner of Mines. Welshmen were, however, freely admitted to the small body of guards which Henry now formed, in imitation probably of Louis XI's Scottish archers. Following the same king's example, Henry at once showed himself favourable to trade. Some London merchants claimed that by old custom they were to pay no tonnage between the day of a new king's accession and that on which his first Parliament met, this indulgence being considered as counterbalancing the extra expense which they incurred in guarding their property at such times, and their claim was allowed. Several Venetian traders who wished to come to England received especial safe conduct, and some other Italians were relieved from penalties incurred under a statute of Richard III. The sweating sickness above alluded to, which broke out among us for the first time in 1485, was one of the most alarming of medieval epidemics, and it recurred so often in these reigns as to deserve a brief description here. According to Dr. Hecker of Berlin, who has collected all existing notices of it, it was a violent inflammatory fever, prostrating the bodily powers as with a blow, and suffusing the whole body with a fetid perspiration. The internal heat which the patients suffered was intolerable, yet every refrigerant was certain death, and the crisis was almost always over in 24 hours. Shortly after the royal entry on September 28th, it began its ravages in the city, 2 Lord Mayors and many aldermen dying in a week. From thence it ranged through the greater part of England, stopping short, however, at the Scottish border and not spreading to Ireland, in spite of the constant maritime intercourse with that country. it mostly attacked persons in the prime of health and strength, and not those who were weak from age, sex, or disease. And this appears to disprove the opinion that it was caused by the presence of Henry's army in London, and was a consequence of the privations which they had suffered on shipboard and on their march. The disease gained fresh terror from the impotence of medicine to grapple with it. So complete was this that the distinguished Linacre, who afterwards founded the College of Physicians, is not known to have written on the subject. Strange to say, this failure of the profession of medicine probably led to its quicker cessation, for as there was no scientific guidance, the people treated those attacked by the light of nature, making them go quietly to bed and stay there till better, taking no food and only the mildest beverages. In subsequent years, when the disease returned and medical practice, as then understood, had risen to the occasion, the very opposite treatment to this was adopted in some countries. In the Netherlands, for instance, the patient was loaded with the hottest garments and crushed, sometimes to actual suffocation, under a mass of feather beds kept down by the weight of several men lying at the top. There is no trace of such violent remedies being ever used in England. On the present occasion the methods of common sense were blessed in their results, for the disease went on diminishing through the autumn, and was at length brought to an end most sudden and complete by the violent storm of New Year's Day, 1486. It is always interesting to observe the moral conduct of a people during a time of terrible pestilence. In the present instance we may remark that when hardly one person recovered out of 100 attacked, and when, moreover, the disease followed Englishmen abroad and spared foreigners resident among us, it did not rouse either the national hatreds or the superstitious terrors which might have been expected. We hear nothing like the execution of Meissen in 1507, of böse Buben suspected of having poisoned the wells, and the theological strife had not yet arisen which induced the citizens of Cologne in 1517 to burn heretics in the hope of averting a fresh eruption of the same plague. Nor can it be said of England at this time, as Mr. Burton quotes of Scotland in 1569, that in time of plague selfishness ruled the day, every one being so detestable to others, and especially the poor to the rich, as if they were not equal with them touching their creation, but rather without soul or spirit, as beasts degenerated from mankind. No cases are recorded like those during the Black Death of near kinsmen forsaking one another, nor were there any such fierce outbreaks of fanaticism as those of the Flagellants, which soon after this maddened Germany and Hungary. Superstition of many kinds was indeed rife in England in 1485, but its types were at any rate somewhat gentler and more humane than those of other countries. End of section 3.